All right, well, welcome everybody. This is a great turnout tonight, and I'm not surprised because it's a very, very important topic to all of us. My name is Darby Line, and I have been affiliated with Jam and All since 2018. Wow. Um, and I have been on the board and I've done this a few times. And anyway, it's just been a wonderful experience. I'm an interfaith minister ordained by One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York. And I am currently the assistant minister and director of operations at Unity of Pompano Beach. Now, I'm in Florida. Many of us are in Florida. I'm just curious if you want to put in the chat where you all are tuning in from. I think it'd be kind of fun to know that. So for those of you who might be new, and I know that there are a couple of people who are brand new here tonight, JAM and All stands for Jews and Muslims and All People. And it was founded shortly after September 11th, 2001, in response to the anti-Muslim sentiment that grew so rapidly after those horrible attacks. And the founders, a Jew and a Muslim, realized that the only way to combat that hatred was to get people together to build bridges over the fear and the ignorance, get them to know each other as human beings and to gain insights into the way they think, the way they worship, and to share the things that we have in common as members of the great family of humankind. So here we are 23 years later, JAM is still bringing people together for that purpose of building bridges and working toward the vision in which all people, all beings are safe, loved, honored, and respected. And over the years, JAM has done many different kinds of events, large conferences and town halls with hundreds of people, small living room gatherings, online roundtables, and everything in between. But everything has been for that one purpose of bringing people together through conversation. And most of the time it also involves food. When we're together in person, it always involves food because food definitely brings people together. So we are so proud to be aligned with many organizations in South Florida and beyond whose mission and vision align with JAM and All's mission and vision of creating a world of peace and harmony for all people. So as JAM continues in its 24th year, we would really like to know what topics and ideas you have. What would you like to hear about? What would you like to do? What would you like to see us bring forward to help bridge the gap between people? So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to just drop it in the chat, or you can always email us at info@jamandallinterfaith.org. So we're so grateful that you joined us this evening, this very special evening, because white Christian nationalism is something that affects and concerns every one of us one way or another. And tonight we're going to hear from a religious scholar who has spent a lot of time, many years in study of this important topic. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have our guest do his presentation for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for question and answer, and you'll be able to write your answers in the chat, or you'll be able to raise your hand using the little hand tool, and our facilitator will explain that a little better than I'm doing at the time. The facilitator, by the way, is our ever-able, multi-gifted, talented Zoom host. Reverend Todd Humphrey is a licensed and ordained Unity minister. He is the minister and spiritual leader at Crystal Coast Unity in Atlantic Beach, North Carolina. He has been a friend of JAM and All since the early days of COVID, when we had to take all of our programs online. And he's just been, over the years, amazing, kind, wonderful to work with, as well as a very dear friend and seminary classmate of mine. Todd and I go back to our very first day of seminary in 2015. So it's almost 10 years, my friend. How about that?
And we haven't aged a day.
Not one. So say hello.
Friends, I am so delighted to join tonight again with another incredible event here with JAM and All about a topic that I am passionate to learn more about. And so I'm so glad that they programmed this and you all decided to join me tonight for my front row seat to learn more about this, and then to find out what I can do try and mitigate the effects of white Christian nationalism in the world. But tonight is going to be a little bit different. If you have been to a Jam and All event in the past, you know that we often break into groups and have roundtables. And our planning committee decided tonight that they wanted us to stay together and to hear the wisdom from Dr. Greg Carey. And so we're not going to have to break into groups tonight. We're all going to stay together for the entire time. You're going to be able to ask questions directly of Dr. Greg, and so just stay here, pay attention, and you can direct message me in the chat if you have a specific question on finding out how to do something in Zoom. But right now, you need to know that I've set it up so that everyone's going to stay muted until you raise your hand or wave into your camera to let us know that you want to ask a question, and then you'll receive a message to unmute. And that way we kind of eliminate a lot of background noise because with this many people participating, which we are delighted that all of you are here, but if everybody has their microphones on at the same time, it gets a little bit crazy to try and hear everything. So, what a great night we have planned. I'm going to shut up and I'll be back later to help to manage the questions. But in the meantime, Reverend Darby, it is so delightful to be back with you, and looking as young as ever.
Oh, thank you, Todd. So good to have you around. Yeah. All right. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening. He is no stranger to Jam. As I mentioned before, he has been a presenter on one of our more powerful online roundtables. I think it was back in 2021. Dr. Greg Carey is a member of the United Church of Christ, and he has a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University. Since 1999, he's been a professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary, which is a richly diverse ecumenical graduate school of theology and officially an open and affirming seminary. Dr. Carey, or Greg, as he just told me he would find being introduced, teaches courses on the New Testament and on biblical and contextual interpretation, along with a doctoral seminar devoted to research methodologies. He is the author and co-author of 10 books, and he's often invited to speak at churches and civic organizations about white Christian nationalism, which he has focused on as a concerned Christian. So without any further ado, Greg, take it away. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you, Reverend Darby and Reverend Todd. Thank you both and all of you for being here. I'm going to click one thing into the chat, which is a bibliography that I've created that supports this work if anybody's nerdy enough to look at it. And then I'm going to share my screen as well. So all of this is there. I'm really grateful for the chance to talk with you. I'll say a few things by way of introduction. One is that it happens a little quick. I'm going to talk about where Christian nationalism comes from and what it is, and then explain why it's dangerous for a democratic, pluralistic society. We can talk about your questions in a little bit, but there's a good amount of information for me to share. The second thing I want to say is I'm not an expert on this subject. I'm a biblical scholar. I've been tracking it and have been corresponding with a lot of the leading researchers, and that doesn't make me any less alarmed than I was when I started tracking it. So let's talk about what we mean when we say something like white Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, in a very simple way of defining it, amounts to three basic ideas. One, Christian nationalists think the United States has a special relationship with God, that God chose the United States, blesses the United States, but then expects the United States to order itself a certain way. And so Christian nationalists want this country to say in a very explicit way that it's a Christian nation. And then they also add that they want the United States to govern itself according to, they'll say a biblical worldview or according to Christian principles. The thing is, I mean, we're in an interfaith conversation right now, and I doubt any of us in this conversation wants to be ruled by someone else's religion. That's a problem. But even among Christians, there's no uniform way of thinking what kind of society we'd like to be in, what we think about public education or status of women and families, LGBTQ issues, labor, environment. You could go on and on. You can't get Christians to agree on anything. And so this is a very narrow political agenda that is attached to the idea that it's biblical or Christian. That's extremely important because it really means that Christian nationalism is something other than just a set of ideas. It's actually a phenomenon. I'll explain why I call it white. And it's an attempt to take that political agenda and baptize it, call it Christian, and use that label for political leverage. So the next slide I'm going to show, there's no dodging that there are partisan dimensions to the conversation, though I will try to avoid naming parties. No chance I can avoid naming politicians. But the next image would be the thing I use to explain what does white Christian nationalism look like when we see it out in the wild. And you might remember this moment. It was the summer of 2020. We're all terrified about COVID at that time. And the Black Lives Matter protests are happening all over the country. In Washington, D.C., there's been some property damage. You see that St. John's Episcopal Church is boarded up. You might remember that then President Donald Trump wanted to stop the protests. And we've learned that he asked the Secretary of Defense, why can't we just shoot the protesters in the leg? Why can't we have the National Guard fire on them? He made a speech in the Rose Garden on this day and, sort of called for the protest in. But then he had security clear a path so that he could walk to this church near the White House. And there he didn't make a speech. He simply stood in front of the church sign and held up a Bible. Why would I choose this picture? Well, you have someone using the church and the Bible, that is using Christian symbols, as leverage for political authority. So when I say they're being used as symbols, or I might even say used as props, right? The Bishop of Washington was asked the next day, what do you think about this? He said, no one asked us if the president could come and use our church. We would have said no. He wasn't welcome to do it. He had no affiliation with that church. The diocese felt taken advantage of. The second reason I say these are props is that's not Donald Trump's Bible. Reporters dug around and found out that he didn't have a Bible in the White House of his own. He's not much of a Bible reader, if at all. And so folks gathered 8 to a dozen Bibles, put them on a table, and he tried them out to see which would look best in a photo op. I think he did really well at that. But what I'm saying is the church and the Bible aren't really part of his life in a regular way. He's using them simply for a photo op to assert his authority. And the thing I'm not saying, that hopefully some of you are waiting for me to say, is because the context is racial conflict, right? A struggle over civil rights for Black people, safety from police violence for Black people. And he is not on their side. So it's not just his political authority that's at stake in the moment, it's white political authority that he wants to embody. Now, you'll hear a lot of debate over the founding of the United States, specifically whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation. And I, frankly, don't have a lot of energy for getting into the debates, but what I will say is, using John Thea's book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, which is the single most important book on the subject in the past 15 years. The answer is complicated about how the country was founded. It's been the case that there's been a stream of people who would say the United States is a Christian nation, all the way back to Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock, all the way through to Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. So I don't want to minimize this. This is a picture of my school, Lancaster Theological Seminary in 1921, hosted a vacation Bible school for the kids. And you see that for them, having a national symbol, the US flag, very common in churches when I was growing up, and also a Christian flag side by side, well, that's a kind of Christian nationalism, an assumption that felt easy for a lot of people at that time, an assumption folks felt was a safe assumption to make. However, where I'm headed is to say that there's been a renewed kind of Christian nationalism that's been bubbling up in our society since the 1950s. It had some early successes getting Under God put into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and In God We Trust as our national motto in 1956. But over the past 10, 12, 15 years, this movement has really flourished. And it's not just one movement. This is something folks need to know. I can't do the whole lecture about it, but I'm using the picture of Mike Pence to communicate that part of it comes out of the old movement of the religious right, Christian Coalition, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan, right? You could name the figures. That traditional movement is still there. On the far right of your screen, you're looking at Senator, Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance, who is a Roman Catholic of a stream called Catholic integralism that believes the government should serve the goals of the church. And in the middle, a movement not many people know about in my experience. When I ask audiences, the yes rate is usually about 20 to 25%. A movement in the middle that is the most active and the most engaged in anti-democratic politics right now of any of the movements, and it is called the New Apostolic Reformation. I'll say more about it in just a few seconds. What all three of these movements have in common is the idea of dominion. And dominion means Christians taking dominion over the rest of society. It's not a democratic idea, right? It's not inclusive. The idea that Christians, the way certain groups of Christians identify Christians, which would probably exclude me, ruling over the rest of us. Now, I want to introduce the New Apostolic Reformation because it's so relevant to our current political moment. The movement's over 30 years old. It comes out of the independent, non-denominational churches that are what we would call Pentecostal and charismatic. That is, they believe that God's still doing miracles like healings and exorcisms. They believe that the Holy Spirit fills Christian believers and allows them to prophesy and speak in heavenly languages. Those are things they share in common with other charismatic Christians. But this specific movement and its ideas have become, there's recent research on this, more and more popular among American evangelicals in general, has some distinctive ideas that are important for why it's had so much influence. First, it's not denominational. It has organizations, but they're very fluid. It's organized around leaders who are identified as apostles and prophets. What that means is the leaders of this movement claim that they speak directly for God because God speaks directly to them. So the governance of churches is top down, and their understanding of government is top down because there is no arguing with someone who claims that God told them what to say and what to do. The second idea that you would want to be aware of is what we would call Seven Mountains Dominionism. It's a very particular idea within the movement, and it's the idea that God wants Christians to take dominion over what they call the seven mountains of culture. which are just about any endeavor that people are involved in, from family lives to government and everything in between. Finally, they have a notion they call strategic spiritual warfare. And I won't go into too much detail about it, except to say that they believe certain regions, certain institutions, certain powerful people are literally possessed by demons, and that it is their job to cast the demons out. I heard one one New Apostolic Reformation leader once say they watched a demonic portal open over the White House during the Biden administration. And you'll hear some of that language later in the presentation of strategic spiritual warfare. So what they're trying to do is mobilize Christians to take dominion over the rest of society and drive out all demonic resistance. Whenever you've seen pictures of Donald Trump as a president or a candidate, surrounded by preachers who are putting their hands on him and praying for him, the vast majority of those preachers are New Apostolic Reformation figures. Almost no one had heard of the movement 10 years ago. I only heard of it about 12 years ago. But their rise to prominence came very much aligned with their support for Donald Trump, which happened early. A recent televised event, a group of apostles offered what they call this Watchman Decree, which is quite long, but it gives a sense of what the movement's about. They say, we decree, which is they are speaking in faith, something they believe. Because they say it, it happens. That's the level of authority they believe they have. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. What you need to know is New Apostolic Reformation figures were highly involved in the chaos after the 2020 election, up to and into the January 6th insurrection. Highly involved. From the election onward, they were hosting online prayer calls with various apostles and prophets that were in part prayer events, but they were prayers to overturn the results of the election. Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, was involved in a lot of those calls. And 8 days before the January 6th insurrection, a group of 12 or 15 of these apostles were inside the White House. 8 days. And they were there for 2 hours. And when they left, a couple of them said, we had this wonderful time of praying and strategizing. Great things are going to happen. There's every reason to believe, reporting is out there, that indicates that New Apostolic Reformation figures were in touch with militias like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, and in touch with people inside the Trump White House in the run-up to January 6th. The movement had a rally on December the 12th, right outside the Capitol, that led to some stabbings and violence in the street because of Proud Boys. They had a rally outside the Capitol on January 5th where they claimed 500,000 people came. And the first New Apostolic Reformation figure I ever heard was an apostle named Cheon from Pasadena, who on January the 5th said, this, you're going to hear the language of strategic spiritual warfare and dominion mixed together. I believe that this week we're going to throw Jezebel, that's their name for a demon that occupies the government. In fact, one of their figures recently called Kamala Harris, well, he didn't call her a Jezebel, he said she has a Jezebel spirit. We're going to throw Jezebel out, and Jehu, a king of Israel long ago, is going to rise up, and we are going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. That's dominion, right? Rule and reign isn't the same as democracy. And there's no gap in his understanding between him ruling, Donald Trump being president, and the will of Jesus. They're all the same thing. Also need to know that they've already begun the work of election subversion. They've begun recruiting at a series of what they call courage tour rallies, only in swing states to let you know what the strategy is. At these rallies, they have sort of a spiritual revival meeting, but it ends by asking people to sign up to be poll watchers or election workers. In response to this, I am now going to be an election worker on election day. But one of the founders of this movement said, it's a Trojan horse operation. They won't see it coming. We're going to flood poll stations across the country with spirit-filled believers. I invite you to remember 2020 in November and December and the chaos that happened in several key states then. Well, they're already preparing that so that these election workers and poll watchers can say, hey, I saw something squirrely, and create chaos, delay voting results, start legal challenges. That work's already happening. That's that part of the presentation. I think you should be scared about democracy. I'll say more soon. There's a lot of research on how Christian nationalism seems to shape people's attitudes, and I'll say this quickly. One bit of the research that's really interesting is that if you look at white evangelicals and black Protestants, generally speaking, they believe mostly the same things theologically. But when it comes to social attitudes about a bunch of issues, gun control, right? Criminal justice reform, poverty, immigration, and on, Robert Jones, who is the founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, points out that the two groups farthest apart in their social attitudes are the two groups closest aligned in their religion. That is black Protestants and white evangelicals. You would think if they agree so much about God, they could agree about other issues. But actually, the people closest to black Protestants in social opinion, measured by religion, are people who have no religious affiliation. White Protestants and Catholics of all kinds are the farthest removed. The way Jones puts it is, the more we white people go to church, the more racist we become. And I'm sorry to say the data bears that out to some degree. What are some of these attitudes that tend to correlate with being believing that the United States should be a Christian nation and govern itself according to this narrow set of laws? Well, more than other Americans, Christian nationalists are likely to demand respect for national symbols and traditions. Pledge of Allegiance, national anthem, you name it. More likely than other Americans, they're likely to be suspicious of racial and religious minorities, especially immigrants, seeing that in our politics. More than other Americans, they're likely to attribute racial inequalities, infant mortality rates, poverty, educational attainment, life expectancy, medical outcomes of 100 kinds, right? They're likely to say that that's because there's something wrong with black and brown people in their communities, rather than to say it's a legacy of racism over several hundred years and of structures that still haven't adjusted to remedy those issues. They're more likely than other Americans to condone police violence and distrust claims that there's racial inequality in the criminal justice system. They're more likely than other Americans to support restrictive voting measures, which tend to target black and brown Americans and also quite young voters and quite elderly voters. People who align strongly with a Christian nationalist outlook tend to believe the two most persecuted groups in the United States are white people and Christians. I don't know what to say other than let that sink in. Christian nationalists also are more likely than other Americans to oppose scientists and science education. So we experience that with great intensity during the reactions to COVID, right? And it was COVID that really activated a new wave of energy among Christian nationalists. But they're also not likely to buy into the reality of climate change, not likely to take social sciences like psychology seriously. And I don't have enough time to go into this. I could somewhere else, but they have created chaos in central Pennsylvania over public education since the 1950s, since the Brown versus Board of Education decision that made segregation illegal. Christian nationalists have been trying to either end public education or take it over. Boy, do I want to talk about that, but we have to save it. But they also are just simply dangerous for democracy. One of the founders of the movement back in the 50s, a man named Rusas John Rushdoony, said, if democracy exalts man to the place of God and the will of man to the place of God, it will fail, and it's failing today. This was an interview with Bill Moyers, I believe in 1987. Moyers asked him to clarify, you think democracy substituted what for the kingdom of God? And he said, the will of the majority. One of the founders of the Christian right, a very right-wing Catholic named Paul Weyrich, instructed his followers that we don't want to encourage people to vote. We actually want to make voting harder, because the fewer people who vote, the more influential is his group, these right-wing Christians. And so when you see the efforts to change voting rules from one state or even one district to another, all of these things are meant to make voting harder for everyone who's not an insider. That's another one I could go on about for a while. Many of you have probably heard of Project 2025, which comes out of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. It sets an agenda in 900 pages. The document that they have is 900 pages, an agenda for a new administration should Donald Trump win the White House. And the Heritage Foundation partnered with this series of identifiably Christian nationalist organizations. These are just the most prominent that I picked out. The section on how should the executive office, the office of the president, be run, it's chapter 2, the only part of the project I've read all the way through except the summary. Russell Vogt, well, he's a Christian nationalist and he says so. And he wrote the piece on how the government should work in terms of the executive office. One final thing along these lines. This is a scale created by a couple of sociologists named Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, taking questions of survey responses to questions that would indicate whether someone supports a Christian nationalist outlook. And what they found is, you see this line, is voting a right or a privilege? Is it a privilege? And you see the line almost moves directly up from the lower left to the top right, to the point where people who strongly identify with Christian nationalist ideas are over 50% likely to think voting is a privilege rather than a right. The next thing I want to talk about is Christian nationalism and its attitudes about violence. When you attend a Christian nationalist rally, as I did a couple of weeks ago, you're going to hear a lot of language about spiritual warfare, about spiritual leaders being generals, about fighting for the truth, about overcoming, about taking dominion. But Christian nationalism has a propensity to encourage people to be open to spiritual violence. Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation that developed Project 2025, this summer said, we're in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be. The best book I read on the subject last year was Bradley Anishi's book, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism, tracking the movement back to the 60s, talking about the ways in which it is militant and tends to encourage violence, whether spiritualized or actually. Last summer, I was invited to debate someone at this event I didn't know it would be called The Gospel at War. It was here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. But you see the idea, the gospel at war, and there's a cross in that ad. But of course, the cross is a sword. It's not just the symbolism, though. What we found is that people who identify with a prompt like this, God intended America to be a promised land for, wait for it, white European Christians. People who affirmed that idea as of 2023, 41% of them would also say that political violence might be necessary to save the United States. 41%. People who said no to God, America, European Christians, people who said no to it, their openness to political violence was only 10%. That's how strong the correlation is between Christian nationalism and an openness to violence. So I'm turning toward my last screen, so we should have a good amount of time for conversation. I am a Christian. I'm not going to do a Christian critique of the movement unless someone asks me, but I do like to conclude by offering some general suggestions for folks to think about. The first is I encourage you, whatever your tradition or non-tradition is spiritually, to guard your soul. And what I mean is there's a lot of us are anxious right now. A lot of us are feeling close to anger. A lot of us are tired. It's important, whatever it is that keeps your soul fresh and tender and kind and resilient and flexible, whether it is corporate worship, whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, whether it's walking your dog, whether it's being with your grandkids, whatever it is, tend to your soul these days, because you won't be effective defending democracy if you're not taking care of yourself. But the second thing I want to say is it's necessary to stay alert. And by stay alert, I mean not watch the news on national TV, which I almost never do. I read the news in a lot of different venues, including conservative outlets, and especially the local news, because a great deal of Christian nationalist activity is happening at a local level, school boards, county commissions, those kinds of places. In Florida, if you're in Florida, in central Pennsylvania, school board meetings have been chaos for several years. And most people don't realize it because they're not paying attention. It's important to find good sources of information, especially local, and stay alert. Third, to overcome Christian nationalism, I'm sorry, maybe I should have said hold off, but it's such a threat to democracy that if Christian nationalists get command of the government, it will take years to undo the damage, if not decades. The energy behind the movement is intense, like we saw on January 6th. It's not enough to go vote, put a sticker on your shirt, take a selfie and put it on Instagram or Facebook that says, I voted, right? That's not enough. It is necessary to organize. Are there grassroots organizing campaigns going on in your region? I'm a part of one here in Pennsylvania. Actually, I'm part of several, but one in particular. It is absolutely necessary. If you want to be a poll watcher or an election worker, or you want to make phone calls or canvass, those are things I've done all of. Remember how determined and energetic Christian nationalists are. The only thing that can withstand energy like that is more energy like that. Fourth suggestion I have is no matter what, most of the time, treat people as people. Don't get into arguments. There's no point. You're never going to say anything so smart you're going to change somebody's mind over politics in our country these days. Try to be respectful. Try to be kind. Listen, share. The only exception is if someone's getting bullied or hurt right then, and it's your job to step in between and be fierce, then be fierce. Sometimes that's necessary. But in those ordinary conversations with the person who just wants to impose their opinions on you, don't lose your humanity with them. That is my failing, by the way, that I tend to have. And then finally, I'll stop the screen sharing. I'm taking this language from the Black church and from evangelical traditions. I encourage you to learn how to testify. And what testifying means in those churches is people get up and they tell the story of how God is being good in their life. I'm not asking you to do that exactly, but what I would ask you to do is take some time after this session and literally with paper and pencil, not a screen, not a keyboard, paper and pencil, write down the values and hopes that are most dear to you and the things you're most concerned about so that you're able to communicate those without having to think them up. And this is important. So I'm just going to model it just for a minute and say a little bit about what that means for me. For example, I want to live in a society where every kid gets access to the same kind of education, same quality of education my grandson gets. I want to live in a society where we think of our social problems as things we can work out together and not regard each other as enemies. I want to live in a society that takes care of the most vulnerable people in it, especially children, especially the elderly and persons with disabilities. I want to live in a society where every person who's here, and I don't care when or how long they've been here, is treated with dignity and decency. I don't want to live in a society that censors what we're able to say. I don't want to live in a society where one religious group gets to speak for the rest of us, and that includes Christian groups, right? And I could go on and on about the kind of society that I hope to live in. If you can practice that, what you're learning is to communicate from your heart rather than have an argument. And there are people who could argue with the ceiling, but what you're trying to do is simply open communication and keep it going. I encourage you to do that. What we're doing right now, we're in the middle of a crisis and it's time to get to work, but the problem isn't going to go away soon. And for the long run, we need to learn how to stay in relationship and build relationship and communicate from the core of who we are rather than getting into silly arguments that never persuade anyone of anything. Well, that's about the time that I had, and I'm thankful for your being patient with me about it. And I know that we have a process for fielding questions. So I welcome that.
Woo.
Said it would be fast.
I am kind of like in a nonverbal state right now. You had me like terrified, and I am. I'm still like my heart is going faster than normal. It's is scary stuff. But I really appreciate your admonition to learn how to share from your heart and not get into arguments. I mean, we all know we've all had those discussions with somebody else. And it's like, you know, no matter what you say, they've got the answer. But yeah, if we can stay true to who we are, what we believe, and communicate that in an honest, authentic way, I think that's got a chance. Todd, I'm going to turn this over to you now for questions and answers. I know I haven't seen any questions in the chat. I've seen a couple of comments, but take it away, Todd.
Okay. Thank you, Darby. And again, thank you, Greg. What incredible information and some recognition. I recently shared some ideas with my congregation that a mentor taught me many years ago, the difference between choice and dilemma.
Hmm.
It's not until you have three options really that you have choice, and you have a dilemma when you only have two, because when you're looking at only two options, then one of them, by definition, a dilemma means that something is going to make you sacrifice one of your own values. And so I love how you brought that home for me. And so thank you for that. And what a great assignment. We are opening it up now for questions. And so I just want to remind you, if you have a question, you can either type it into the chat, and I will read it, and we'll wait for Greg to respond to that. Or you can raise your hand. And we already have one person, so I'm going to ask Shannon to unmute. And Shannon, I'm going to add you here into the spotlight so you can ask your question.
Hi, I come to you from non-denominational, meaning I am not a churchgoer, but this all has really affected me here in Alabama with a lot of book banning and other efforts. I have two parts of my life: family that I don't think realize that the beliefs they have are headed towards this Christian nationalism. It's like if I could give them a roadmap, they would see the path they're taking is leading there. I don't know how to approach that. It's not my job, but I do my best. And then I'm also in my work life in public service fighting organized groups like Moms for Liberty that are taking over from the local level, as you said, school boards, library boards, and it's incredible the work they've been able to do in such short order. I guess my question, if I could formulate one, is how to approach those you feel are going down that road or had those beliefs.
That's hard. I think the testifying thing is really important. I would reemphasize you're not going to argue somebody out of those beliefs. You could ask, if anybody's interested, the bibliography I shared in chat. You could ask someone if they'd be willing to watch one of the films. I think I listed 4 films. One's 25 minutes long. You could preview it and see what you think are best and see if they'd be willing to discuss with you. That's one possible way. The other way is to express the way I was talking about why, ask them, what is it that's so important to you that draws you to this? And then you can share what it is within you that's concerned. But look, I mean, your chances aren't high. Thank you, Shannon. It's so good to see you, hear your voice. Same hometown. We go back to 12 or 14 years old. So
just a couple years.
yeah.
Okay, let's see. I don't see another hand up, but I've got a couple of questions that have come in through the chat, so I'm gonna start there. What is the effect that you're seeing from groups like Freedom from Religion or Americans United? Are they having an effect? And what's the return on that investment? Like, is it good enough? I mean, what more can we do?
I do think those groups have an effect. I think their primary effect is educational. So, when I started doing these presentations a couple of years ago, what I found was people very concerned about the country, but not so aware of the role Christian nationalism was playing in our politics, and especially with things like election denial. And these groups work really hard at public education. I don't do these talks to change people's minds. I do the talks to inform people and alert people right? And maybe resource them. They do that. There are other groups that are doing things like legal work. I don't know if y'all know, but the Biden administration, I've heard, is 10 times as many lawyers ready to go in this campaign as they did last time. Well, now it's the Harris campaign. That's an indication of how serious the threat is. Here in Lancaster County, we just had a 2-day news story that a local college, the students were told that their ballots didn't count here. They do, but they were told by an election official that they don't. So lawyers are active.
Wow. Then our next question comes from Ted, and we'll see if we need more information because I can unmute him. Ted is asking that you address the issue of slouching towards Gomorrah, this belief that God is punishing nations that allow God's moral code to be violated.
That's a great question, Ted. That's not a phrase that I just had top of mind, but I'm almost 100% sure I know what it means. You can go back to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, right? You get a hurricane, and they'd say it's because of the sexual sin of New Orleans or something like that. It's not a new idea. And Christian nationalists, the one thing I would add is, I think, Ted, you indicated that you're Jewish. So Christian nationalists read Israel in the Hebrew scriptures as meaning us. And so passages that give warnings to the people of Israel of what will happen if they don't act faithfully, like Deuteronomy or some of the prophets, they apply to the United States as part of their vision. Was that a helpful answer to the question you were actually asking?
I'm trying to get back to my gallery view. And there you go, Ted. You can unmute now.
Great. Yeah, I think, was it Robert Bork, the Supreme Court nominee, who wrote the book Slouching Toward Gomorrah, and
Oh, thank you.
espoused those issues. But just to build on it a little bit, and my own perspective might be helpful. You know, in the early part of the Hebrew scriptures, there is a sense of community or national responsibility. And the sin will be visited to the third and fourth generation, even in the Ten Commandments and those sorts of things. But I think as you move forward, you have a different sense, even among the prophets, of individual responsibility instead of corporate responsibility. Ezekiel says the sinner himself, would pay for the sin, not the sin of the father.
Yep.
And this is certainly a Christian principle as well, that people are judged individually according to their sin, and then later Judaism the same. So a lot of these Christian nationalists are using outdated theology from more than 3,000 years ago, before the time of Isaiah and Ezekiel, to espouse this communal guilt.
We could talk a long time, Ted. Yep.
Hope that was
Thanks.
helpful. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ted. Camrose, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and I'll add you in as a... You're unmuted now.
All right, I'm there. First, I want to congratulate Greg on a very fine presentation. It was excellent. I never thought it would be that good. And I thought I knew a bit of this, what was happening, but you really threw some light on it, to the point where it looks like it's getting scary. And so I'm now a little bit more aware of the reality of what's going on. So again, thank you for that presentation. And one of the interesting things is when you were pointing out what the America stood for, and they said that the Christian principles, and I am a Muslim, but I'm quite okay with Christian principles if it is based on the principles of Jesus Christ. So if you're using that as a yardstick, then I'm on board with Christian principles in accordance with the teachings of Jesus Christ.
And I think I understand that from a Muslim perspective, as well as I might. The issue for a Christian is that, and I've started a little study of preaching in this New Apostolic Reformation tradition, and they almost never mention the teachings of Jesus, or
That's right.
they're interested in a narrow construal, mostly of sexual morality and of idolatry. Those are the two things for them that are really important. And so they want God named everywhere. And of course, they want women subordinate, and LGBTQ people to not be LGBTQ people. So they're not much interested in love your enemy, love your neighbor, blessed are the poor, blessed are the lowly, blessed are the peacemakers. You just don't hear much of that language.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Good question.
Thank you, Camrose. And I've got another question coming up here in a second, but I want to comment that it's interesting because I do come up from a Protestant background, and Greg, in your presentation, you said that you identify as a Christian. And I lead a unity church, and I think a lot of people joining us tonight know what unity is. But I told my congregation, stood up and said, you can call yourself Christian if you want to. I can't do it anymore because it has this incredible, uh, like asterisk next to it now that seems to mean something that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the teachings of Jesus, which I love and talk about every week. I feel supported, and what a diverse, like multifaceted kind of understanding that we have to come to and deal with this. I am told that Irma had her hand up. Irma, is that right? Yes. You can unmute now, Irma.
Dr. Carey, your presentation was great. I couldn't write fast enough.
Sorry.
You mentioned something, and it was someone that was going to church, but wasn't getting anything out of church, was becoming less religious the more they went to church. Could you say this about the WCN? That's what I call White Christian Nationalism.
Well, what Robert Jones was saying is that
and also, could you give us an idea of how large this group is, and are they really religious?
Yes, they're very religious. So there were three parts. The more white people go to church question was Robert Jones showing that survey data shows, I'm going to say it the nice way, the more white people go to church, the farther alienated they get from the social values of Black Christians who share their theology. So it's, to us white Christians, to me, that's a scandal. But it seems to be the case. Numbers are hard to pin down. So right now in the United States, about I think the number is 13% of Americans would identify as white and evangelical. And so 40 million, 45, 50 million. How many of them are Christian nationalists is a different question. It's a pretty high percentage, but I don't have a handle on it. The New Apostolic Reformation movement, it's not a denomination. There are no statistics. The question is their influence, and their influence is massive. And it's shown especially in those gatherings where Donald Trump gathers pastors around him Who are those pastors?
Mhm.
They come from that movement. So that's the best I know how to do with that question. But I can say a study came out this summer by a couple of sociologists or political scientists showing that the beliefs I talked about with New Apostolic Reformation have spread well beyond that movement, so that most white evangelicals affirm those beliefs.
Last question. What are the other churches? Are they aware of this movement? And
A lot, yeah. I'm sorry.
what are they doing about it?
A lot of churches are not aware. A lot of churches are trying to educate. There's a lot of energy going on to educate. I've probably this year done 20 or 25 of these talks. Most of them have been in churches. Most of them have been in the mid-Atlantic area, but not all. So it's a point of emphasis, but I think that by far most Christians don't realize what the threat is. For that matter, if you ask most Christians, would you like to live in a Christian society? There's a very good chance they'd say yes, because no one defines what that means. According, to get to Kamruz's point, no one defines what that means
Right.
specifically. May I note, Todd, that there was a question earlier from Linda about
Yes.
what attracts people to Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I was just now coming back to that one because I had to scroll up because so many comments came down. So yes, we'll jump into that. We have the question came up about what is attracting people to these congregations, to this Christian nationalism theology, and because we're seeing it across. The education spectrum.
Yep.
We're seeing it across an economic spectrum. And so where's the attraction?
I think there are multiple layers. One is there are some people who are attracted to a belief system that is exciting. New Apostolic Reformation services are built around excitement, music, lights, healing services, dramatic. That's part of it. Another attraction is some people are just attracted to being part of a movement at all. It gives you a sense of identity. You're part of something, it's important, you're struggling for it, working for it. And then I think there's a negative dimension. I mentioned Robert Jones a couple of times. His first book came out in 2016, and the title is The End of White Christian America. And what he was documenting then was that 20 years ago from now, about 60% of the population of the United States would have identified as white and Christian. His numbers this year are 41%. Whenever there's dramatic social change, the majority group freaks out. We've seen that happen in Europe with demographic changes from immigration, and several democracies have kind of fallen. Poland has gotten its back. Hungary has not. Slovenia, you could go on and on, all the way to Sweden. These totalitarian movements as a response to demographic change in Europe. Well, we're seeing some of the same. And I would add, please understand that I have devoted a lot of my career to activism for LGBTQ inclusion. So I'm not blaming LGBTQ persons for this. But you'll hear a lot of white evangelicals say how fast it's changed in our society. And a way to measure that would be the commercials you see on TV.
Right.
Right. And, I'm 59 years old. When Shannon and I were in high school, she may have known people who were out. I did not. Now, every kid knows that about a fifth of their class is out in some way or another in high school. That's a dramatic change. And a lot of people find those changes threatening. To white conservative Christians, it means they're losing control. And so an appeal like Take America Back Again, that is speaking specifically to that anxiety of certain kinds of white Christians.
Lots to ponder there. Thank you so much. Camrose, go ahead and unmute again.
Yes, Greg. I can understand where white America feels threatened, especially with the changing of the overall dynamic of the society. And I suppose if you are not confident enough or knowledgeable enough, then you would get scared. And I suppose so. It happens a lot with people who are don't think too much or just feed on what the press is feeding them, or listening to those who are more influential in their lives. The other thing is, I wonder if you're taking a very serious stand here and a very dangerous one. I'm wondering whether you ever felt threatened, because I suppose you're out in the public with this and you're known for your stand that you're taking. So I'm wondering whether at any point in time you feel threatened or have actually got threats against what you're doing.
Not directly. I've had a couple of creepy incidents where I thought, I wonder what that was. I've noticed bots on my social media lately, which is weird. And we had a local Christian nationalist podcast that spent an hour talking about me once. I thought, ooh. But the truth is, I'm nobody, right? They're going to be more interested in other people than they are in me. So no, not really. But thank you. I do appreciate your asking.
Okay.
People I would be concerned for is I have friends who have been school superintendents, librarians, and they have had direct, not just mean calls, but direct threats.
So it is getting serious.
Oh, it's very serious around here.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Camrose. So I'm curious to know, Greg, because you've been studying this for such a long time. What are some of the best practices that you've seen in grassroots organizations and activists who are working to combat these activities? What are the best practices? What can we learn? Just
It's very helpful when collectively groups speak up in a way that people can hear. And it's very helpful when people, believe it or not, my kids will never see a letter to an editor, but a lot of people do see letters to the editor. And I found when I wrote an opinion piece in the paper once, to Kamruz's question, I mentioned a couple of Christian academies in Lancaster County that are basically Christian nationalist indoctrination factories, and both headmasters wanted to talk. So it lets you know that people do pay attention to those kinds of things. It's just so important to, in an organized way, let people know that they don't speak for us. That when they say biblical values or Christian values, well, you have spiritual values too. They might be Christian. And it does help in particular for Christians to speak out, but speak out for your own. And if you can do it in an organized way, that at least has some effect. I don't want to take too long with this question, but Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is 600,000 people live in this county. It's not like small town Amish. You may have heard of the Amish here. and a lot of Christian nationalist activity in school boards. The municipality where I live is a red Republican school district. But this year, all of the Republican candidates were Moms for Liberty candidates. And people knew it. Now, there are a couple of districts where they have elected Moms for Liberty school boards, and those school boards have already hired the Independence Law Center to help them write in anti-trans policies. So there's a lot at stake. But a couple of the districts that are a little more purple, like the one I live in, it's red, but it's a little purple. It wasn't even close. They voted for the Democratic candidates because they knew what the Republican candidates would do. So you can't win all the time, but that sort of organizing, making people know thing is really important. To Shannon's question, yes, Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a good organization.
I've asked Kathy Leonard to unmute because she had a question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
She's got to unmute first.
No, I was just wondering, for one question, are there any groups or in Florida? I mean, a lot of us here are in Florida, a lot of people are not. Are there that we could affiliate with when you talk about organizing? Any suggestions or groups that have outposts or anything like that, or we need to start organizing ourselves?
Locally, I don't know, but I bet there are people on the call who do. And I forgot at the beginning of the call just to say I hope everybody's okay, because y'all have gotten crushed in Florida late summer and fall, and we've been watching. But I don't know the specifics there.
Okay, just curious. If there isn't other questions about this, I'd be interested in more you speaking a bit more about the threat to public education. You were ready to speak about that if there's a little bit of time.
I can do the short version.
Yes.
So there's a lot of history associated with the rise of the Christian right that suggests that race was at the heart of it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of that bibliography is, and so one thing that happened when schools desegregated was every southern city all of a sudden had a bunch of new Christian academies, right? Which were essentially churches creating schools for their white kids to go to school.
Yeah.
Without other kids. Those schools are still there for the most part, right? So the homeschooling movement also comes out of that movement. So do the campaigns to take government education funds and give them to private schools. It's an attempt to take the money away from public schools, put them into narrowly sectarian schools. And so if you pay attention to this kind of Moms for Liberty activities at local levels, what you find is the people who are there are very earnest and concerned about all the issues they talk about. I saw a school superintendent recently at a party, and we're good friends, and I said to them, "So I hear you have porn in your car," because they're always hearing that if they have a book that shows a kid with two parents of the same sex, they'll call it porn. Or a book that educates kids about puberty, they will call porn. It's always something. And the reason it's always something, whether it's how you teach race history, whether it's how you just address issues of gender in school, whether it's the books, whatever, someone is making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year or more figuring out what agenda will drive these volunteers to lose their minds, I'm sorry to put it that way, and create chaos in the public schools. And in the long run, the goal is to break public schools or take it over.
Right.
Shannon is a librarian. She points out that Trump has stated he'll dismantle the Department of Education. That's in Project 2025.
Mhm.
We had a Christian nationalist candidate for governor in Pennsylvania in 2022. He was going to cut the public education budget in half.
Hmm.
Right? Both of Shannon's comments in the chat are directly spot on. But what I really want to say is if you pay attention, the issue will change all over the country on a dime because somebody is sending out the communications that what we're upset about today is this. And that shows that it's a highly funded, nationally organized campaign. This isn't coming from volunteers who are just watching the news and getting upset.
Right.
Rabbi Deb, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Am I muted?
No, you're not.
Okay. So, well, you mentioned that Biden's administration has all of these legal people to address what is going to come. And it sounds like the president has said, I guess if he doesn't win, it's going to be a bloodbath. So this is the second attempt. So what do you see happening here at November the 5th or the 6th?
Well, or 9th or 10th.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say that the election will not be called on election night unless we get a big surprise.
Mhm.
And that creates space. We know that one campaign will say they're using this time to cheat because they did that last time.
Yeah.
We also know that they have prepared in many jurisdictions people who count the votes who denied the results of the election last time. So we're going to go through a period after the election, unless the result is really clear. We're going to go through a period of chaos, I think. I'm not a doomsday sayer. I expect there will be some political violence. In Pennsylvania, we had, if you go back, I think the 60 Minutes from the week before before yesterday covered Pennsylvania. We had protests right outside the vote counting, especially in Philadelphia, that didn't result in serious violence, but there was shoving and that kind of thing going on. So just calling attention to, I'm not expecting absolute chaos, but it will be very tense for weeks to months, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Irma, and thank you, Greg, for that wonderful explanation. So we've got one other question that has come up in our chat that I want to direct you towards. This comes from Samira, and differentiate for us the Israel that is in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures and the modern state.
Sure.
And what that difference is, and see if you can draw any lines for us to help explain why this white Christian nationalism has become so pro-Israel, and see if you can weave that together for us.
One of the most striking things about American evangelicalism compared to other forms of Christianity in the West and in the United States is sort of an unquestioning support for the nation of Israel. To the degree that within that movement, and I've been part of it, so I'm speaking from experience, Palestinians are literally invisible to them. They don't care. And when I say they don't care, it might not even cross their mind that there are Palestinians who are living on the land in a pluralistic society for a long time, which is the case. The reason that they've gravitated that position is that during the Cold War, they developed an attachment to what they call Bible prophecy and the idea that history is hurtling toward this final conflict. They're using passages from the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament to put all this together. And they think this final conflict is going to revolve around Jerusalem. So, in an unquestioning way, they support Israel. When I say unquestioning, I want to be extreme. This is an interfaith group. There have to be people who are feeling very raw right now over what's happening in Gaza and what's happened in Israel. And I don't want to assume that I know what anyone else is thinking or get out of my lane. I want to acknowledge you. Enough suffering to go around, and I have my own opinions. But they wouldn't be able, like many of the Jews that I know, to be critical of the government without undermining their support for the nation of Israel, for example. It's just not a move that's made. And so they don't make that kind of distinction. The question of the continuity between biblical Israel as a nation and the modern nation of Israel is as much theological as it is historical. Right? Jews who settled Israel said this is our homeland because it is in an ancestral way. And at the same time, the Israel that was known in the Bible was almost depopulated twice. So it's just a very contentious conversation.
Well, thank you for that wisdom. I do want to invite Zib Nader to unmute and to turn on their video if that's possible. With a question. You're unmuted now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I just noted that the meeting was being recorded. I did have to go in a few minutes, but I was just wondering if the recording was going to be shared, and if so, how so? Sorry, it's a bit off topic, but I just wanted to make sure because this is all very fascinating, very interesting, very informative, and I just wanted to make sure I got a hold of the information. That's all.
Absolutely. Yes, you will be able to review the video and share a link to it. And the plan is that in the next 2 days, I will get all of this processed and sent over to Ken, and then he will get it uploaded to the Jammin' All's YouTube page, where it will reside, and you'll be able to take a look at it and go back and visit and invite friends and family and to go there and see that, and then you can share your bibliography that you've downloaded that was in the chat box. Everyone will be able to do this and start having these conversations and doing your work. I briefly had a chance to look at your bibliography, Greg, and there's one book that I'm gonna see if you have an opinion on this, and this will be my last question. I've been working on a book with people in my congregation, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion by Jonathan Haidt. And it's opened up a world of understanding and actually making me a little bit willing to engage in some conversations that are really uncomfortable.
Yeah. I haven't read the book. I've heard long interviews with Haidt about the book.
Okay.
And, essentially what I understand that he does is he maps out research that shows that people who tend to vote liberal or conservative actually have some generalizable character qualities. So I'm a pretty classic liberal. The Righteous Mind, Bobby, is the name. I'm a classic liberal. Throw me a new idea. Great. Allow me to meet somebody who's very different than I am. I'm excited. Whereas someone I have a conservative streak in me that I tend to value loyalty. That's something conservatives are typically good at. And the way he's not trying to say these are good or these are bad. He's trying to say, if we would understand these values, that they're actually positive values, we could understand each other better. The other thing I want to add, there is a group that may be in Florida called Braver Angels that trains people in groups to have the kinds of conversations you're talking about, Todd. I haven't participated, but I just heard a report from a friend who said it was one of the best experiences they've ever had.
I've had a number of people in my seminary cohorts who rave about Braver Angels. Zib, you wanted to come back and ask one more thing, so can you unmute again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with everything that's been said so far, I wasn't sure if I don't know if I caught this earlier on, but I was just wondering if there was a distinction made between, right, the state of Israel and Zionism. Was there a distinction made between the two, and like how it's matter of fact, like I've come across, I've talked to Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Jews, and I know they denounce Zionism. That's actually the movement that's been overtaking Israel and causing a lot of, chaos and instability in the region. So I was just wondering, like, and this goes for the entire panel, like the room, what the distinction or what your thoughts are on the difference between Zionism and the state of Israel, meaning Orthodox Jews.
I'm not the best person to ask.
Okay.
And so if a responsible scholar will always say that. What I can say is I've heard Jews I know use the word Zionism to mean different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so that might be a starting point to track down how that term functions and what it means in a practical way. Because I think there's a range and they would
Right.
result in very different politics.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Well, friends, I know it's going to be hard to believe, but we are already at 9 p.m. And so I want to bring Reverend Darby back. We're going to say some thank yous, tie some of this up. And again, Greg, what an incredible sharing tonight. We are so grateful.
Yeah.
Reverend
Thank
Darby, take it away.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Just the thing that keeps going through my mind is I'm thinking of people that really need to hear this. As soon as this video is processed and shareable, that we all need to share it with people because it's so informative. It's not judgmental. It's not argumentative. It's just so powerfully educational. And I am so grateful. This is like life-changing for me. Thank you so much. So I guess I would just like to say to everybody who's still on the call today that if you've enjoyed this, or not, I don't know if enjoyed is the word, but if you resonate with what we're doing here in JAM, this presentations like this, there are two ways you can make sure that they continue to happen. One of them is to just become a member. It's only $20 a year. You can do it on the website jamandallinterfaith.org. Because just like all organizations, we've got bills to pay too. And your contribution, your support says you support what we're doing, and it helps us keep going. And the other way you can help us is by stepping forward and just saying, put your hand up and say, I'll help. We have a lot of ways that people can help and be involved. Simple, small things and more complicated things. Right now, the top of our wish list is somebody who has an interest and skills to post on our website. And it's, we will lovingly and joyfully teach you how to do that if you're not familiar with it. And also to post on our social media platforms. So that's just one thing, but get involved. Stay in touch with us. Keep watching the website. If you're not on our mailing list, you can do that on the website too. And let's just keep the conversations going, because the world needs what Jam and All is doing. And case in point, what we've just all experienced tonight. So thank you again, Greg, for a marvelous, marvelous presentation. Do you have any last words you'd like to share before we wrap up?
You all stayed with this for an hour and a half. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be a part of it, and I'm grateful for the invitation.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have you back again. So you haven't heard the last of us.
No,
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Todd, for your, as always, wonderful support. Thanks to all the board, Jam board members and event planners, and all of you for being a part of this experience tonight. So I hope you have a wonderful evening and a great rest of your week. Many blessings to you all.
Thanks, Dorby.
Thank you.